Hello, my name is Anjalee Gunaratnam. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. Today my talk will be on Latimer's Matter, the Decomposition of Self, Hegelian Dialectics, and George Eliot's Physics of Sympathy. So that's sort of a mouthful, so we're going to just focus on George Eliot's Physics of Sympathy today. I'm not going to be talking about Mark Twain today, mainly because back in 2022, I was lucky enough to speak at the Quarry Farm Symposium about the fascinating scientific and philosophical questions that were emerging across the pond during Twain's era. So at that time, I was talking a lot about H.G. Wells, the famous time machine author, as well as the romantic bird poet John Clare, which is sort of an unlikely pairing. But mainly, I spoke about their attunement to matters of perception, time, and about how both birds and creatures from a Wellesian future are best examined in flux and in natural movement. I've taken some of that interest in motion and in movement into my doctoral work. So now I specialize mainly in sentiments and feelings within Victorian literature that lie on that hazy boundary between science and metaphysics. So problems of space, time, perception, consciousness, dimension, and ultimately the nature of reality. We have Wells and Claire here. So today I will be speaking a little bit about George Eliot. She's the main focus of my first chapter for my dissertation, and her most intellectually favored emotion, which was sympathy. So sympathy for Eliot was not merely a sensation of compassion or of camaraderie, of feeling with, or even an expansive connection between two people. She was thinking about its operations and motions in terms of a larger organic system of vitality, of Hegelian flux, and of energy. So for her, sympathy was not merely an ethical concept, it was not merely a social concept, it was always a metaphysical one. It operated for her with some necessary truth, some inherent logic, seen in the fundamental nature of reality itself. It was a principle that not only held humans together while maintaining their boundedness and their opacity, their individuality, but it also possessed for her an intelligence and an intuition that binds and builds the smallest and most complex levels of matter. So these ideas are all situated within a dissertation I'm working on called Energetic Phenomenethics, Thermodynamic Sensibilities, and the Metaphysics of Sympathy in Victorian Fiction. So I examine energy in all of its thermodynamic, quantum, spiritual, and metaphysical implications within late 19th century England. This was an exciting time for energy, as the coal industry was obviously booming at that time. Electromagnetic fields had been discovered by people like Hans Christian Ørsted and Michael Faraday, and people were also pondering about this invisible electric fluid and these imponderable ethers that powered the human body and soul. So authors like George Eliot, Wells, even Twain, people like Hawthorne, Emerson, they were all referring to concepts like light, heat, force, diffusion, potential, but they were using them not only to describe objects or environmental systems, but also to articulate the intricate energies, feelings, and affective dynamics between people. So they were very concerned with interiority as well as relationality, just how energy builds us and also moves through us. So I'm especially drawn to polymathic artists like Eliot because she was so intellectually competent in such a wide range of fields. She was always reading something about chemistry, theology, philosophy, physics, and she uses this natural interdisciplinarity to power the human insights she makes within her fiction. So she writes, of course, wonderful realist works like Middlemarch, which I'm sure many of you have obviously read, that feature really interesting scientific questions about epistemology and the nature of truth, but she also dabbles in some interesting supernatural and science-fictional writing like The Lifted Veil, which fewer people have read, but I would highly recommend that everyone do read it. It's a drastically underestimated work, and in both we see traces of her ponderings about whether energy is related to the human spirit, and if matter is a necessary component of the consciousness, even love. So why physics and literature? It's kind of an odd combination. Energy physicists of this time were not arriving at energy concepts in a scientific vacuum, as much as modern scientists would like for you to believe. Thermodynamicists of Eliot's time and Mark Twain's time, like Lord Kelvin, James Clerk Maxwell, Michael Faraday, they were all essentially performing what I call an epistemic conversion of sorts. So they were essentially building upon old theological and literary notions like power, like heat, like force, and instead of displacing their qualitative value entirely, were actually refining their intuitive meanings into exacting scientific quantities. So in other words, the creative intuition that they had, the whole or the form, they were sensing before seeking out the evidence. They would feel and then find the proof in the natural world or in the lab. Einstein, for example, would go on to describe this movement of mind during his conception of the relativity theory. He says, quote, "I very rarely think in words at all. A thought comes, and I may try to express it afterwards. During all those years, there was a feeling of direction, of going straight towards something concrete." Frequently described among these initial creative intuitions is a motion of the consciousness that propels without clearly knowing, driving into a yet-to-be-discovered thing that appears not as formulas or as actions, but as an undefined whole, both intangible and slippery. It is in movement, yet temptingly in reach. Another example is Michael Faraday. Now, Michael Faraday was a good friend of George Eliot's, and he, along with the Danish philosopher and scientist Hans Christian Ørsted, discovered the relationship between electricity and magnetism. He was responsible, essentially, for introducing the idea of electromagnetic fields, or lines of force is what she calls. He had worked out some of the highest powers of mathematical analysis through a kind of intuition. Physicists were linguistically borrowing from intuitive ideas like space and like time that had no real sensory analogs, and that's what makes it especially distinct from fields like chemistry or biology. They're working with very interesting abstract theoretical phenomena that can really only be captured with linguistic or literary forms of language. They were extracting expressions from ancient Greek texts. For example, Aristotle was the first man to essentially coin the term energeia within the Nicomachean Ethics, as well as the physics. And of course, in the Old Testament too, energeia is used to describe how God is essentially using his divine power to enact certain types of work. They're using metaphors from literature, of course, and also everyday speech. And so physics metaphors are really interesting because they have this poetry of ambiguity to them. Think of words like heat, diffusion, force, energy. These words may be used in razor-sharp modes within physics. They may have precise formulas, but they still trail their old weight of meaning. The language of physics is therefore both precise and universal, technical yet intuitive, and full of feeling, yet sometimes none at all. And its linguistic density makes it especially conducive to literary operations. Okay, we'll turn to Eliot's dialectic thinking. So, for one of my first chapters, we're looking at Eliot's draw to energy, as well as her draw to concepts of streams, fluxes, and channels, which, of course, most people associate with water. But water and energy and electricity were kind of borrowing from the same pool of linguistic associations. So I began to uncover why Eliot was so compelled by these pliable boundaries between physics and metaphysics. She was very much a dialectical writer, so she was constantly drawn to this vacillation and calibration between two opposing experiential realities. So she was always thinking about the double nature of her own mind, which she calls a double consciousness, as well as the double hemispheric nature of the brain as well, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and how they work together, and yet are also sort of taking in the world in very opposite or antithetical ways. So, what was the curious nature, she asks, between the relationship between body and spirit, between materialist and idealist systems of thought, empirical and romantic ways of experiencing, and between parts thinking and whole thinking? The roots of this dialectic type of thinking is found in one of Eliot's earliest letters in 1848. So she was still quite a young woman at this point. She had not yet written Middlemarch. She had not yet written Adam Bede. She was still sort of developing herself intellectually, and she had entered this intellectual circle called the Rose Hill Circle, where she was interacting with people like Charles and Cara Bray, many different scientists, artists, philosophers, and during this year she was heavily corresponding with a man called John Sabri, a Hegelian critic, and she had been reading a lot of Hegelian philosophy at this time. So in this letter, you get a flash of insight into her thinking about matter, energy, and their ties to sympathy, which she often relates to love. She tries to get at how love might be a sort of organizing principle, and works from her understanding of Hegelian phenomenology, literary metaphysicians like Coleridge and Wordsworth, and various scientists. So she writes to her friend John, "Creation is the superadded life of the intellect. Sympathy, all-embracing love, the superadded moral life. These given more and more abundantly, I feel that all demons, which are but my own egotism mopping and mowing and gibbering, would vanish away, and there would be no place for them. Evils, even sorrows, Are they not all negations? Thus, matter is in a perpetual state of decomposition. Superadd the principle of life, and the tendency to decomposition is overcome. Add to this consciousness, and there is a power of self-amelioration. The passions and senses decompose, so to speak. The intellect, by its analytic power, sympathy, ethics, love, according to Eliot, restrains the fury with which they rush to their own destruction. The moral nature purifies, beautifies, and at length transmutes them. So here, Eliot is describing the flux of an individual's consciousness as a series of volatile states that can create higher and more complex wholes, all composed of matter, or at least that is the foundational element, and bound by an energy that moves in organizing flux, bearing and constructing from its own composition a more intelligent form of organization, the highest of which is ethics, sympathy, and love. Note the series of adding and superadding that she mentions in this paragraph, the advancing layers of organization of matter in dialectic tension, growing from itself. This passage was not an isolated occurrence in Eliot's work. It wasn't simply just a literary experiment in her letters. You see this type of thinking, this vitality type of thinking, building and honing themselves throughout her multidisciplinary reading, writing, and translating, from 1850 all the way up into the 1870s when she writes Middlemarch. There is some referral to a movement of emergent complexity, a movement of flux and flow that helps Eliot build an original theory of sympathetic energy. This would continue to stream throughout the rest of her characterologies. Words related to energy, matter, force carried with them various semantic and conceptual valences, and Eliot was attuned to this. Alongside her era scientists, many German idealists also catalyzed this type of thinking in Eliot, especially Hegel, as they had received their understanding of flow and flux from the cosmology of Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic philosopher who was sort of a foundational philosophical figure for energy science as it stands today. In the philosophy of Heraclitus of Ephesus, the concept of becoming occupies the foremost place. 20th century physicist Werner Heisenberg writes, and the difficulty to reconcile the idea of one fundamental principle with the infinite variety of phenomena is solved for him by recognizing that the strife of opposites is really a kind of harmony. The world is at once one and many. It is just the opposite tension of the opposites that constitutes the unity of the one. Reality, Eliot came to realize, was like consciousness. It was always in a state of becoming. The nature of Eliot's fiction, along with the content itself, possesses this dynamicism that is not only felt in the reading experience, but able to be theorized into metaphysical reflections about energy as a kind of feeling, as a flux that unites the dialectic relationship between matter and spirit, between the empirical and the ideal. Eliot's stylistic approaches were also highly drawing from this idea of flux as well. She has a sort of stop and flow nature to her writing, so she also theorizes while engaging in this dramatic sort of engagement with the plot. And this sort of reflects the way that her mind is also working as well. Always examining, flowing, examining, flowing. So Eliot therefore explores energy through this concept of dialectic and flow. Each is essential to the other. To be is to therefore become, and becoming is not one simple fluid movement, but an imperceptible flow constituted of constant dialectic tensions that overcome and learn about themselves. Energy flux philosophy had an expansive legacy before Eliot's correspondences with her friend John Sebree. Her contemporaries like Schelling, Schiller, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and other romanticists and German idealists were fascinated by the motions between the finite and the infinite, and how the human imagination, this relationship, as Coleridge writes, to some eternal force, moved with the seamless and complexifying patterns often perceived in the creation of organic life. These organizing flows occur with a certain immediacy that can rarely be perceived by the mind's eye, in staggered succession. It is rather comprised of collisions that dissolve and move forward by learning about themselves. So Eliot is not merely dramatizing these metaphysical systems. She's considering them very carefully before generating her own conclusions. And from this, she quickens the ideas to life and sets in motion the expansive particularity of human relations. So lastly, I'll touch a little bit on her science fiction, her only science fictional work, really, which is called The Lifted Veil. And she is working from this character of Dorothea as well. Well, Dorothea is actually more of a product of Latimer, who is the main protagonist of The Lifted Veil. Beneath Dorothea's brooding exterior in Middlemarch, for example, is an interiority flooded with, quote, electric streams, as Eliot writes, in paroxysms of feeling, desires for and against others, as well as this moralizing power of thought, which seeks to step back and philosophize about ideals and encounters. For example, quote, Miss Brooke, Dorothea, argued from words to dispositions not less unhesitatingly than other young ladies of her age. So she's constantly caught in this tension between words and dispositions, between feelings and these desires and these whims and these fears, and her ability to theorize and philosophize about her moral decisions. But in considering the reconciliation of these tensions, Eliot is also confronted with a terrifying alternative: no reconciliation. What occurs, she wonders, when different areas of the mind, the whole thinking imagination versus the analytic and reflective area, perpetually collide and never integrate into one another, into a higher form of understanding? They must surely clash until they decompose, as she writes in her letter. They create a collapse in the system. As she writes, quote, the passions and senses decompose. The intellect, by its analytic power, sympathy, ethics, love, restrains the fury with which they rush to their own destruction. So it is Latimer, who is The Lifted Veil's protagonist, who not only informs Eliot's composition of Dorothea's warring impulses, but also serves as the illimit extremes of Eliot's double consciousness, which were often subject to decompositions. Her venture into the science fiction genre is therefore very, very deliberate. Latimer is Eliot's artist's brain at its most overstimulated, a personified mental state expressed as a gift curse of the writer's heightened sensitivity. The flip side to such sensibility is a hellish mental state, at once power and weakness. Latimer is presented as both a speculative creation that exposes the truth of being a sensitive person, but as simultaneously very human, even pitiful, in his yearning to lift the veil over his eyes again. These glimpses into Latimer's humanity can only be caught, ironically, through the warping mechanisms of science-fictional artifice. A walking defiance of what is physically and cognitively possible, Latimer becomes, rather than all-powerful, a sad distortion of humanity. This leads him to become an example of dysfunction within Eliot's very specific system of vitality, a victim of perpetual decompositions. Latimer is therefore a philosophical experiment for Eliot, as she takes ethical sentiment and anatomizes it and physicalizes it into a living, breathing individual, and she asks, if we were to remove the fleshly and cerebral boundaries that prevent us from truly knowing one another, would we be better people? Would that increase our sympathy? Is sympathy a collapse into the other, or does true knowing require some level of opacity, some aspect of not knowing the other? Latimer is bestowed with the power curse of sympathetic clairvoyance, with this ability to hear and see other people's thoughts, their roaring noise data of consciousness. And unlike the 1848 quote, which details the dialectic impulse to clash and then integrate and rise into a higher form, to hold contending realities at once, Latimer cannot synthesize them. He says to his audience, quote, are you unable to give me your sympathy, you who react to this? Are you unable to imagine this double consciousness at work within me, flowing on like two parallel streams which never mingle their waters and blend into a common hue? He cannot integrate the parallel streams. They are in constant dialectic tension. Only systems imbued with vitality possess a creative force, with a tendency for curiosity and ever-building complexity. Latimer is the antithesis of this. He never integrates his observances, only lets them flow through him transparently. This apathy lies at the root of why Latimer's human relationships remain dysfunctional. The lack of desire to connect to another, similar to the motions of artistic curiosity and expression, prevents Latimer from reaching a dynamic of mutual relationality. This quickens his decomposition.
Running out of time.
As a result, alongside Eliot's aesthetic concerns as to whether dialectical experiential realities could be properly grasped in her representations, she is grappling with metaphysical concerns. She is troubled by the clashes within her own artistic consciousness, ones that refuse to resolve into higher forms. In other words, Eliot had somehow experienced the higher organizations of love and of sympathetic energy, but also its collapse. Both encounters of failure and learning are essential to the artist. Thank you.